the people who align with my socialist position mean by socialism. This is just not what we're talking about. We're not talking about an authoritarian state that has absolutely no regard for the environment, doesn't use markets to the best of their advantage. It's just not what's being discussed.
Thank you both for being here. So a lot of scholars trace sort of the emergence of the essential conditions of capitalism, sort of 16th, 17th century, Eastern, Western Europe. And this time period also corresponds with sort of European colonialism as well as the Atlantic slave trade, and both of which still continue to have effects on all societies in the world currently. So I have just a question for both of you. Do you see the sort of correspondence of these three different ideas, capitalism, colonialism, and sort of racism through slavery, as merely a coincidence, or do you think they sort of have some connections among them?
Not a coincidence at all. There's a connection among these three things. I mean, I know libertarians are in principle opposed to slavery, and I think we should recognize the contributions that ideological libertarians made in the anti-slavery movement. However, I would say that the idea of that growth above all, of the fact that you can enrich yourself at the expense of other people, that you don't have to care about the least fortunate among you. I think that is that kind of ideology that says, you know, everyone benefits when I benefit. And I think that is very common today. I think that is a unifying thread in capitalism, colonialism, and the slave trade. And in fact, when slavery was abolished, you see the same. Interestingly, what you see is the same ideology kind of transmuting itself, which is, well, okay, now we don't have slavery. Now we believe that people own themselves nominally, but if you look at the situation in the Jim Crow South, if you look at the situation in the industrial North after slavery, you had a free market. You had people who entered into so-called voluntary contracts, but they're not really voluntary because there's a massive imbalance in the distribution of power, and the relationships of slavery sort of reestablished themselves in the years after the abolition of slavery. They just established themselves under a new guise. What was the unifying thread, though? This idea that my enrichment helps other people automatically. You do see the capitalism and colonialism arose simultaneously, and you can separate these two things in theory. You could say, well, the subjugation of colonial peoples is not that violates the libertarian non-aggression principle and what have you, but you can't separate them as a matter of historical fact. Which is that they arose together, and that colonialism is the source of, is absolutely the source of the growth of American prosperity. You can't separate the development of America as the richest country in the world from the theft of land, the genocide, and the slave trade that built this country.
I guess I would argue that they're not connected. Initially I was going to say, well, I guess maybe they're connected because capitalism produced wealthy societies and therefore had the resources to go out and oppress other societies. But then I started thinking about the actual history of it. Colonialism started basically in the 1500s and 1600s, and capitalism really got going in the 1700s, 1800s. So I don't think the history really matches up perfectly. But again, I'm willing to accept that maybe there was some overlap, some connection. Having a capitalist society doesn't mean that the leaders of your society are good and just. It simply means that you have a system that generates more wealth. You always need morality. You always need a sense of justice. So yes, sometimes people in capitalist societies will behave in abhorrent fashions, but God knows, in socialist societies, whether we're talking about the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics, or whether we're talking about the National Socialist Workers' Party in Germany, countries were governed by, under at least some form of socialism, in my mind have displayed the worst and most horrific examples of immorality. But no, capitalism is not, I think, in any way connected with these bad behaviors. And I'll simply also note that the classical liberal tradition, which is in Europe, liberal means free market. And so we tend to use the phrase classical liberal to make that distinction from modern American liberalism, which is more statist in orientation. Who were the people who were fighting for the abolitionist movement? They were the classical liberals. So the biggest advocates of free markets were also the ones who were the biggest advocates of abolition and eliminating slavery, as well as extending the right to vote and things like that. So I think the classical liberal tradition is something that we can be enormously proud of in the Western world, because it's what stopped a lot of these bad behaviors.
I just want to respond quickly on Nazis being socialists, because this, you often hear National Socialist, haha, it's socialism. But actually Hitler himself made clear that they just used the word socialism opportunistically. There's a quote from him where he said, our use of the word socialism has nothing whatsoever in common with Marxist socialism. If you want to establish whether a country is socialist, it's best to ask yourself, does it follow the principles that socialists say they advocate? Is there workplace democracy? Are workers empowered? If it doesn't have that, then it's about as socialist as the Democratic People's Republic of Korea. North Korea is a democratic republic. It's not. Any country can call itself anything. The question is it? And if a country doesn't have the empowerment of workers, if it doesn't have economic democracy, then the word socialism is just a lie. Anyone can use it. This is why I reject the idea that National Socialists and Socialists are the USSR is socialist. The same way I reject Kim Jong-il's and Kim Jong-un's attempt to portray North Korea as a democratic republic, which we know it isn't.
I think you have time for some hands in the back. Yeah.
Hi, so I was wondering, I know we can pretty much all agree that the idea of economic growth, competitive economies, and also human rights and worker rights are generally a good thing, right? So I was curious if you could speak, first of all, Dr. Mitchell, to the idea whether in a free market economy can we create a mechanism for ensuring that workers have rights, especially if people who don't have income or the power to guarantee those rights, how can we ensure in a free market economy that people have a safety net? And also to Mr. Johnson, how can we ensure that in a system where, how can we ensure that people, incentives for economic growth are still there, if we have all this wealth distribution and, or perhaps overregulation of business?
All right, well, I'll take the first shot at that. I guess it depends what you mean by rights. I don't believe that the government should pass laws mandating that, say, there are worker representation on boards of directors and things like that. Here's the bottom line. Workers get paid on the basis of their productivity. In the long run, there's no substitute for competitive open markets for raising productivity and therefore raising wages. If you start allowing politicians and bureaucrats to start interfering with corporate governance, and Elizabeth Warren has a big piece of legislation that would in effect move us a big, I think, a dangerous and risky step in that direction, you're going to wind up undermining the prosperity and the vitality and dynamism of the U.S. economy. Now again, Nathan and I we sort of agree that there's this spectrum, and we agree that, okay, you make government, give it more control, there's a little bit less economic growth. We might disagree on the magnitudes of it, but I can't help but just repeat what I've said before. In the long run, I think the wealth generation, the effect of compounding on economic growth, and what that means for the prosperity of a society, I don't want to sacrifice that, especially because I think that any power that you give government is necessarily, maybe not necessarily, but in so many cases, is going to wind up getting captured by those that do have the power and the wealth. So that's another point where we agree on, but we reach different conclusions about what the implications are. If government gets more power, I'm concerned that that power will be misused by people who will see government coercion as a shortcut for obtaining unearned wealth. I would rather people earn wealth by providing goods and services in a genuine, competitive, open economy.
Can I ask you a question, Dr. Mitchell? Do you believe that a company should be allowed to fire a worker if she gets pregnant?
I believe in private contracts, and if I set up a company and I say I want people to come to me if they can commit to work for 3 years without interruption, I think that's something the government should not interfere with. Now, I'm very happy, though, that I live in a rich, largely capitalist economy where we can afford, in an increasing number of cases every single year, to give people more leeway and flexibility in workplace arrangements. I'm delighted that we have capitalist inventions like the internet and remote work that give people more leeway and flexibility to have flexible work arrangements when they have sick children, when they have pregnancies, things like that. I want the wealth that a free market economy generates because it's that wealth that enables us to have much more comfortable lives. I don't think government mandates, as a matter of fact, let me close this comment by just citing one thing. A feminist columnist in the New York Times wrote a piece a couple of years ago noting that when governments have passed these paid leave laws that Nathan keeps extolling, it winds up increasing discrimination against women of childbearing years. If you're running a small business, and by the way, 9 out of 10 small businesses fail, so it's a very dicey proposition. You take that risk and you're trying to create a business that's going to survive, you're going to look at a young woman, and if you have some government laws and mandates that in effect implicitly increase the potential cost to you of hiring that person, guess what? You're going to be less likely to hire them. So I want the same result I think you want. I just think that we're much more likely to get that result in the thriving, dynamic, free market economy, not through the government mandates and regulations. I mean, look at Europe. Europe has all this, what you're talking about is actually called social protection or EPL, employment protection legislation. In Europe, youth unemployment is 25% and regular unemployment is twice US levels. Now, is it all because of social protection and EPL? No, of course not. There are all sorts of different factors in the economy. But I think what we have in the U.S. is giving us more of what we both want, and I think that the government command and control regulatory approach is going to have all sorts of adverse consequences, some of them indirect, such as encouraging discrimination against women of childbearing age.
Yeah, so what you heard is that, no, people shouldn't have rights at work. They shouldn't have any rights. Really, your employer should be able to terminate you for any reason. If you get sick, if you get pregnant, the incidents in your life, the unexpected incidents in your life, you shouldn't have any rights. Your employer should be able to terminate your contract. And in fact, you should be able to, total freedom of contract. We've seen what this means actually in increasing use of arbitration clauses and non-compete clauses that say that even if you've managed to negotiate, maybe because you have a union, you've managed to negotiate some agreements for something beyond at-will employment, maybe do a hearing before you get fired, you might still not get a day in court because you've signed an arbitration agreement that says that if you disagree with the way that your employer handled your termination, you have to go to an arbitrator picked by the employer. And there's nothing stopping that. And because there's a differential of power between capitalists and workers, you have to sign whatever contract they offer you. Unless, as I say, you have a union, which is why we on the left believe that you have to band together and have unions. These laws, these paid family leave laws, first, they usually exempt small businesses. They usually exempt businesses below a certain size, precisely because of that you're wanting people to take risks. The countries that have these laws are often very economically dynamic countries. It doesn't hurt. If you have anti-discrimination protections, you can mitigate some of the downsides. But interestingly, and I actually noticed this because I was reading a Cato Institute study about paid family leave laws, and what they do is they selectively quote there are a bunch of studies on the effect of paid family leave laws, and they selectively quote all of the downsides, like the fact that you might increase discrimination against women, without quoting any of the upsides, which is that the studies have consistently found that if you give a modest period of paid family leave, it increases female employment, increases female satisfaction at work, more women are able to join the workforce, and they're able to spend time with their kids. They're able to spend time, they don't have to go, I mean, let's think about what this really means in people's lives. Well, what it means is that if you're a woman, you get pregnant, you have a child, you don't have to go back to work 2 days after you give birth. That's hugely significant. Imagine giving birth and then you have to go back to work 2 days later because you can't afford to take any more time off, because you'll be fired if you take any more time off. Now, most industrialized countries of the world have recognized that that's just an immoral situation. And it happens every day in the United States of America. It happens. Most people don't have any specific paid maternity leave, paid family leave. They don't have it. And it creates, the kind of, think about the pain that people go through as they have to say goodbye to their newborn child. I mean, it's really very disturbing when you think about it. And I'm disturbed by the libertarian approach to workplace rights, which says essentially, if the boss wants to do it to you, they can do it to you. If they harass you, you got no remedy. You got no legal remedy. You're SOL. You are stuck. Again, sucks to you, because you signed the contract. Freedom of contract is absolute. Nobody has any rights. You don't have any free speech rights. If the employer wants you to take a drug test, if the employer wants you to give them your social media passwords, wants to comb through your Facebook, your only option is to give it up or go elsewhere. And if you can't go elsewhere because you need your job, then basically your employer can do absolutely whatever they want. And that's why people get sexually harassed on the job. That's why, do you know how large wage theft in this country is? Wage theft absolutely dwarfs burglary. People get their wages stolen, right? Which means that employers just don't pay them for overtime. And the thing is, theoretically, your contract, it's a violation of your contract. Problem is, you don't actually have any enforcement rights. Yeah, you can go to court, but you don't have an attorney. You can't afford an attorney. So that's why, because of this differential of power between owners and workers, nobody can get, even if you did have some limited rights, like the right to be paid for the work that you did, unless you equalize that power differential, unless you give people, unless the government funds access to legal services, unless the government makes sure that there are serious penalties on employers who violate your rights, you get stuck, and a bunch of people get screwed over every day. And anyone who spent time in low-wage workplaces, who knows people, knows the realities and conditions in workplaces in America, and it's horrifying.
And with that, if we could give a huge thank you for everyone. TSU event is actually going to be next week, day after fall break on Wednesday. It's going to be a chat and chew in Frank, the Blue Room for dinner, and it's going to be about the midterm elections with Professor David Menefee-Livy. And again, thank you all for coming. I hope you had a good time and learned some good things, and thank you again.
Thank you so much.
Also, we have the room until 9 o'clock if anyone wants to stick around and talk a little bit more with our speakers. Another 20, 30 minutes. So, stick around.
And you can find